Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the second public webinar on the development of the New Zealand Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. My name is Jessica Desmond and I'm leading the development of this work from the Centre for Sustainable Finance, Toitu Tahua. This work is in partnership with the New Zealand Government. Also today, you'll be hearing from our colleague Pip Band from the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I'll leave it to Pip to introduce herself later. As many of you will know, work began last year to develop a sustainable finance taxonomy for New Zealand, beginning with the agricultural and forestry sectors. The first sets of draft criteria will be available for your feedback in June of this year. We'll be welcoming feedback from stakeholders to ensure the criteria are both effective and relevant in the Aotearoa New Zealand context. If we can go on to the first slide, please. So today's session is to help you prepare for what you can expect to see in the consultation and how to respond. I will briefly review the basics of the New Zealand taxonomy, why this work is being undertaken, what it aims to achieve, and what decisions and directions have already been made. Pip will then walk you through the development of the taxonomy and the methods and sets of criteria that will be included in the draft for consultation. I'll then answer a couple of the key questions that have been submitted and finally walk you through the details of responding to the consultation. Before that, however, I'm excited to announce that today we are opening an expressions of interest process to identify experts in climate change adaptation and resilience to join the next phase of the taxonomy development. If you go on to the next slide. We are looking for expressions from people who are experts in climate change adaptation and resilience in both the agriculture and forestry sectors. They will join the technical advisory group designing the criteria for the next phase of the taxonomy on a 3-month term. I won't spend too long on this, but if you are interested in finding out more, you can head over to our website now, and I believe the link is on the next slide. We will take expressions of interest until May the 21st, and the first meeting will be held on June the 5th. So you can see the URL there to find more details and apply to join this group. Great, next slide, please. So moving into the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. Next slide. A Sustainable Finance Taxonomy is a classification system which essentially labels economic activities based on their contributions to meeting environmental goals. We know that the long-term prosperity and resilience of Aotearoa will require targeted capital investment, including in both agriculture and forestry sectors, to ensure that farmers and foresters can transform their operations for a low emissions future while maintaining their economic vitality. Next slide. The New Zealand taxonomy will create a common language between investors and businesses. It allows investors and financial institutions to more easily identify credible, sustainable investment opportunities, thus increasing the flows of capital into them. It also helps businesses identify opportunities to access sustainability-focused capital. And it establishes transparent and credible standardized performance criteria for both sustainability claims and financial products. Next slide. Around the world, sustainable finance taxonomies are implemented or under development in 58 different jurisdictions. As the global financial sector adopts sustainable finance taxonomies to identify, assess, and measure the environmental credibility of investments, taxonomies will become a prerequisite. By developing a New Zealand-specific taxonomy, we are ensuring that classifications and criteria applied to New Zealand businesses are relevant and appropriate in our domestic context, while remaining interoperable. Next slide, please. So to be crystal clear, the New Zealand taxonomy is about providing this clear classification of economic activities. A taxonomy does not rate companies or provide any other investment information. It doesn't create a mandatory list for investment, nor does it exclude any activity from any other form of finance, and it is not an additional compliance framework, although the taxonomy basis may be used for reporting. On to the next slide. So that is a very SparkNotes version of what a taxonomy is. if you still have questions, I would encourage you to watch the previous introduction webinar, which goes into more detail and is available on the taxonomy page on our website. I'll now talk briefly about the work that has been done in the first phases of the project and some of the directions and decisions that have been made that will impact the design of the taxonomy criteria. Next slide, please. In 2024, following an initial scoping phase, CSF, at the invitation of the Minister for Climate Change, convened an independent technical advisory group known as the ITAG, who put together a series of recommendations for the development and the design of a New Zealand taxonomy. Based on these recommendations, which you can also find published on the New Zealand Taxonomy page on our website, the Minister directed work to begin on the New Zealand Taxonomy for climate change mitigation and adaptation and resilience criteria, starting in the agricultural and forestry sectors. In directing this work, the Minister made several key prioritisations and decisions related to the taxonomy. If you go on to the next slide. So first was that prioritisation of the climate change mitigation, adaptation and resilience objective, and those first two sectors for development. Some of the other key directives have been to consider the inclusion of a transition category in the taxonomy, which Pip will speak to a little bit more, that the taxonomy will initially be voluntary, and that the taxonomy must be closely aligned with the Australian taxonomy that's currently under development. These directives have important implications for some of the decisions about the design and approach of developing the New Zealand taxonomy criteria, which will be discussed later in the webinar. If you go on to the next slide. So finally, I just wanted to share how the process for developing the taxonomy criteria works and the governance structure. So there are two working groups who are developing the contents of the taxonomy. The Technical Advisory Group, or the TAG. This is a sector-specific working group who are providing technical input into developing appropriate definitions and criteria for agricultural and forestry sector activities. Then there is a Technical Experts Group, or the TEG, and the TEG consider the usability, interoperability of the criteria. And they also provide oversight and endorsement for the TAG's work and consider how the taxonomy is delivering on the purpose and recommendations that have been endorsed by the Minister for Climate Change. Each group is roughly 20 individuals with representatives from the ag and forestry sectors, civil society, academia, the financial sector, real economy participants, and iwi and Māori interests. These groups have drafted the technical criteria, which Pip will be outlining. Their work is overseen by the Ministry for the Environment and reviewed by a government quality assurance function, and that will be done before it is submitted to the Minister for Climate Change for his consideration. With that quick overview, I will hand over to Pip now to talk you through the different components of the New Zealand taxonomy, including what you can expect to see in the draft for consultation.
Thanks, Jess. So just by way of background, I'm working for the Climate Bonds Initiative on the New Zealand taxonomy, and I've also been working on the Australian taxonomy. I'm a sustainability consultant, and my focus is on agriculture and food systems, and previously spent about a decade in the red meat industry developing their sustainability programs, and also some time in the finance sector in corporate affairs and sustainability at Westpac. Next slide, please. So the New Zealand taxonomy has 6 environmental objectives, which you'll see across the top here. Define green and transition climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation and resilience, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystem, pollution prevention and control, and finally transition to a circular economy. So the next row on the chart is the process by which activities are classified as either green or transition. I'll talk to this in a moment. So the New Zealand government identified the priority sectors for developing the New Zealand taxonomy, agriculture and forestry. So obviously today we're talking mitigation, which will then be out for consultation soon. And we're, as Jess said, beginning to work on adaptation and resilience. Other sectors identified are transport, construction and real estate, energy and industrial manufacturing. So the key component for each environmental objective is defining the substantial criteria, which I'll outline in a few moments. But we can basically think about substantial contribution criteria as the guidance to determine what activities are deemed to make a substantial contribution to the environmental goal for this consultation mitigation. So in addition to the substantial criteria, do no significant harm are developed to ensure that activities in one environmental objectives don't cause negative impact on the other stated goals. I'll talk to this in a minute, but there's both generic and specific, do no significant harm. And finally, minimum social safeguards apply at entity level for all proponents engaged, aligning to the taxonomy. So MSS is governance and to ensure activities don't result in adverse social outcomes. So I'll step through each of these in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So firstly, what makes a green or transition activity? So in the New Zealand taxonomy, the TEG, as Jess mentioned, have chosen to classify both green and transition. So not all taxonomies include transition, but financial institutions require credible and consistent criteria as a tool to progressively steer economic activities towards taxonomy alignment and also to safeguard against greenwashing. So while defining green remains a priority for New Zealand, a separate transition category allows capital providers to incentivise companies making substantial progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So broadly speaking, green activities are those with low or near emissions, which are already aligned with the Paris future. That is keeping temperature well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Transition activities are those that achieve emissions reductions beyond business as usual, and hence are making substantial movements towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. So transition activities have a continued role in a low emissions economy. They drive significant step changes, as we've said, beyond business as usual. They do not have an existing low emissions alternative, and where feasible, they also will have sunset dates. So one of the first activities of the technical expert group was to develop the methodology for categorising green and transition, and this will be available in full for the consultation. Next slide, please. So the substantial contribution criteria assesses whether an activity is making substantial contribution to an environmental objective. In the instance of this consultation, that of course is to climate change mitigation. So the substantial contribution criteria include performance metrics. These are either as emissions reductions thresholds, or where the data is not sufficient to set a threshold, practices with scientific confidence in their efficacy may be used as a proxy for emissions reductions. So where possible, the TEG technical expert group are keen to use thresholds across the taxonomy, and figures will be included in the draft for consultation for feedback. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, the intent of the criteria is that the measures go beyond business as usual and shift the needle towards Paris alignment. Like all aspects of the taxonomy, the substantial contribution criteria are based on credible and robust scientific evidence. Where there's been insufficient data, we've put in practices, or we've admitted practices for this draft. Likewise, where practices are not yet commercially available, even in the late stage of R&D, they have been omitted. But there will be provisions for regular updates of the taxonomy that will allow for new technologies to be added. Next slide, please. So the DNSH criteria ensures an activity that makes a substantial contribution to one of the environmental objectives, say climate change mitigation, does not cause significant harm to any of the other environmental objectives in the taxonomy. In this way, DNSH is a risk management tool to ensure that there are no perverse environmental consequences of an activity aligned to the taxonomy. So DNSH are not intended to achieve positive environmental change by themselves. While it's tempting to approach this holistically to ensure positive movements across all environmental objectives, this is not how the structure of taxonomies work. DNSH is really about preventing negative environmental impacts. Positive environmental impacts are handled through the substantial contribution criteria for each environmental objective. Next slide, please. So MSS ensures that New Zealand taxonomy-aligned activities do not result in adverse social outcomes by requiring entities to comply with certain minimum social standards. MSS typically expect alignment with various social and responsible business conduct standards related to core themes such as governance standards, international human rights, which includes labour rights, anti-bribery and corruption measures. The New Zealand taxonomy also contained guardrails to protect the rights of iwi Maori and cultural heritage. So the purpose of MSF provisions is to prevent activities from being labelled as sustainable if the entity is not acting in accordance with these minimum social safeguards. So like DNSH, MSS criteria are not intended to achieve positive social change by themselves, but rather to prevent negative impacts. And unlike DNSH that's applied at the activity level, MSS is applied at the entity level. Moving on to the next slide. So to recap, for an activity to achieve alignment to the New Zealand taxonomy, there are 4 things that are required. Firstly, does the activity classify as green or transition? Next, does the activity meet the substantial contribution criteria? So it needs to demonstrate a substantial contribution to at least one environmental objective, for example, climate change mitigation. Thirdly, does the activity meet the do no significant harm criteria? It must meet both generic and, where applicable, activity-specific DNSH criteria. Finally, does the entity undertaking the activity meet the minimum social safeguards criteria to protect social outcomes? So it's only when these 4 steps are satisfied will an activity be considered New Zealand taxonomy aligned. Next slide, please. So for consultation, feedback is being sought on the following: the methodology for defining green and transition activities for climate mitigation. This methodology applies across all sectors contained in the taxonomy, so not just agriculture and forestry, but will also in time cover transport, construction, manufacturing, energy. The substantial contribution criteria for mitigation for forestry, agriculture, and other land use. The do no significant criteria, both the generic that applies across all future sectors included, as well as forestry and agriculture, and also specific, which is the specific DNSH just for agriculture and forestry where relevant. And minimum social safeguards. As I mentioned, these will also apply across all future sectors, as well as forestry, agriculture in the taxonomy. And so really it's those four key aspects. So the methodology for green and transition, substantial contribution, DNSH, and MSS, that will be all out for consultation. So thank you. I'll now hand back over to Jess for the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Pip. So there were questions submitted in advance of the webinar, and I do believe that the content so far hopefully will have answered a number of them. I'm just going to take some time now to quickly answer the most common ones that may not have been covered yet. If you did submit a question that isn't answered today, you can expect that either we will be reaching out to you directly because it's a very specific question and we'll address it with you directly, or it will be answered in the materials surrounding the consultation or on our website in advance. So the first most common question was about desire to consider other environmental objectives, whether that was marine and aquatic impacts, biodiversity, or pollution. As Pip has spoken to, the structure of taxonomies is such that they focus directly on the activities that advance a single environmental objective through the substantial contribution criteria. As Pip discussed, there is protection in the do no significant harm criteria, which ensures that this myopic focus doesn't have adverse effects on the other environmental outcomes, but each set of criteria under the taxonomy can only make progress on one objective at a time. At the moment, we only have the directive to focus on the climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience objectives. There will be, of course, some overlap with biodiversity goals as we get into developing adaptation and resilience criteria. But a sustainable finance taxonomy that makes real progress on any of the other objectives will need to be directed for development by the government. Then this whole process of convening expert groups and developing appropriate criteria can begin. Consideration for what the next steps for the New Zealand taxonomy should be, that is whether we develop further sectors or develop further environmental objectives, will be a question that you can respond to in the consultation, and we encourage you to do so. Moving on to the next most common question, which was about the inclusion of Māori knowledge in the development of the taxonomy and support for use. So the New Zealand taxonomy is being designed to include Māori knowledge and uphold rights, and it is the first taxonomy globally to embed this as a core design principle in the approach, which means that there have been specific innovations in the criteria, particularly in the do no significant harm and minimum social safeguard criteria, to ensure that this is happening, and you'll be able to review these in the draft for feedback. In terms of process, we're achieving this through both the structure of the membership of the working groups, as well as formal engagements, such as with the National Iwi Chairs Forum, who are represented in the TEG. The New Zealand taxonomy does provide an opportunity to support the Māori economy and also Māori access to capital. So we're working both through these formal channels as well as directly with stakeholders and organisations who have engaged with us to ensure that the information to support appropriate engagement with the taxonomy is available to Māori and Māori organisations. If you represent a Māori organisation, particularly in the agricultural or forestry sectors, or with other relevant interests to the New Zealand taxonomy, and you would like to engage with us, please do get in touch with the Secretariat. Their email will be at the end of this presentation, so we would really love to connect with you. And finally, the bulk of the rest of the questions really came down to interest in how the New Zealand taxonomy has considered and is learning from other taxonomies being developed globally. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, there are 58 jurisdictions globally developing sustainable finance taxonomies. So we are definitely not the first or only people doing this. Interoperability has been a major focus of the New Zealand taxonomy development, and this is particularly crucial for Aotearoa New Zealand as we are an optional capital market. We have looked to benchmark taxonomies, especially across our trading partners, including the EU, Australia, Singapore, and others. CBI, who are the technical developers of the taxonomy, have also worked on, designed, and developed many of the global taxonomies, as well as conducting extensive reviews of established taxonomies. So we are benefiting from their deep technical knowledge and expertise in designing the New Zealand taxonomy. You will see that there are strong similarities across global taxonomies. For example, many taxonomies use those same 6 environmental objectives that we are pursuing, and this helps to create a more interoperable and integrated system. So yes, our approach is very deliberately and very thoroughly globally aligned. Okay, moving on to the next slide, into the consultation process. So, if you move on to the next slide, you'll see this very detailed timeline, but we are here in May, and at this stage, the final draft criteria for climate change mitigation activities and the criteria that PIP has outlined through this session are about to enter the government quality assurance function, which will bring us into the first consultation opening in mid-June. The consultation will be open for 4 weeks. And you can see here on the timeline that we are also planning to do a second round of consultation in August and September, with the final taxonomy technical documents being delivered in November of 2025. If you move on to the next slide, as Pip, I think, is pretty clearly outlined, but we will be in the first consultation seeking feedback on the draft activities and criteria for climate change mitigation goals, as well as the overall approach to defining the green and transition activities and the overall do no significant harm and minimum social safeguards. The second consultation, which will be open in August or September, will include revisions to these first sets of criteria based on the feedback that we get in the first consultation, as well as the new set of criteria with draft activities and associated substantial contribution criteria for the adaptation and resilience activities. For this consultation, it will be presented in 4 parts. So one for each of the different sets of criteria. It may be that you only want to respond to one set, or you might want to respond to all of them, or a combination of them. So you'll be able to use the materials and the response setup to do so. We're really encouraging a wide range of stakeholders to provide feedback on these drafts. They can only be appropriately shaped for New Zealand's needs and context if we hear a diversity of views. Once the consultation is live, you'll be able to read all of the detailed criteria, methodologies, and associated supporting materials on the Centre for Sustainable Finance's website. We will be taking responses either through filling in the online form, which is presented on that website, or if you prefer to write a free-form submission, those will also be accepted, or the responses to the questions posed will be prioritised in analysis of the feedback. The best way to make sure that you don't miss the consultation is to sign up for updates on our website, and then you'll receive an email notification when the consultation webpage goes live. And that brings us to the end of our presentation today. Thank you so much, Pip, for joining us, and for all of you. Please reach out to the Secretariat, as I said, if you have any questions or you would like to engage in more detail on the taxonomy. We will be hosting another webinar once the consultation is open to provide guidance on navigating the criteria and the materials. So we hope to see you there, and we hope to see your feedback in the consultation. Ngā mihi nui, thank you very much.